Good evening. Welcome. My name is Michael Mulholland with the American Family Association. Tonight's topic is New York and the fiscal problems that we're going to be facing over the next couple of years. New York is facing one of the most serious fiscal issues it had to face in decades. On top of this is a growing property tax problem in our suburbs and educational quality problems in our city schools. What can be done without forcing more New Yorkers to flee our state? Our guests tonight are Larry Levy and Frank Russo. Larry Levy spent 30 years as a reporter and columnist for Long Island Newsday, covering politics, education, and tax issues. Larry is a member of the Brookings Institution and often appears on local TV and radio programs. Frank Russo is a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon and serves on the executive committee of the Nassau Conservative Party and Long Islanders for Educational Reform. He is also the president of the AFA of New York. Frank is married with 7 children and 27 grandchildren. Welcome.
Thank you.
And my co-host this evening is Connell Friel. Connell?
Thank you, Mike. Larry, let's start with you.
Sure.
New York State is facing an unprecedented financial crisis, and the country is as well. What, in your view, are the root causes of this financial crisis?
That's a great question, and there are a lot smarter people than me have been trying to wrestle with that. I would say 2 things, 2 G words. One is goodwill, and the other is greed. You've got a lot of people who want to do a lot of things to help a lot of people. And I think most of them are well-intentioned. Some of them want to help because they want those constituencies to support them, to vote for them. But a lot of people go to either Albany or Washington or wherever they serve because they do want to make a difference. And everybody wants to make a difference at the same time. And well, the federal government has the ability to print money, unlike Albany does. So I think that in one part, the impulse to do things that spend money. The other problem is greed. If you look at the roots, for instance, of the financial meltdown, it's from top to bottom. It's from the executives who indulged in very, very dicey financial instruments, some of the derivatives, some of the subprime mortgages, and people who bought houses, and I don't want to blame victims here, but people who bought houses, they really should have known they couldn't have afforded, because anytime you have a deal that's too good to be true, it isn't. So I would say greed and goodwill, a combination of good impulses and bad ones.
Thank you. Frank, same question, but maybe you could focus a little bit of how it's hitting New York because of the disproportionate amount of financial
because Wall Street is so heavily involved. But
Sure.
And I agree with Larry on the causes. I view it as 4 distinct causes. The very foolish loans made to people who couldn't afford homes, being urged on by greedy mortgage people and bankers and so forth, often at the urging of politicians. And I've seen video clips and quotes from people that we didn't expect to see it from. I mean, the image, because Bush was president, I think the Bush administration got blamed, but largely it was people like Charles Schumer, our senator, Senator Christopher Dodd from Connecticut, Barney Frank from the Banking Committee on the congressional side, Maxine Waters. I've seen all these videotapes and quotes where they put a guilt trip on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and banks and mortgages for not making loans to certain people that fit into certain minorities. And the implication was that there were discriminatory bases for refusing to make these loans. And so when initially there were some objections by certain people to this, Barney Frank especially, Chuck Schumer, put the guilt trip on them. They put pressure on all these banks and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to make these loans, take these absurd risks. And of course, when prices were going up, there wasn't much of a problem. But once that stopped, the crisis accelerated. And then that was factor 1. Factor 2 was the credit rating agencies. Fitch, Moody's, S&Ps. I think, in my judgment, they should be civilly liable because they can't be that dumb that they didn't know that there were a certain percentage of these that were extraordinarily risky loans,
right.
And they're rating them AAA, deceiving the investors. So I think I don't see how they're not sitting now. Maybe they have an excuse, but that should be part of their defense. A third factor is leverage. Like I said, I've said this before. I did my master's thesis on we called the debt ratios at the time, Baruch College, on the utility debt ratios. Phone company, we had a debt ratio of, it was called 33%, 1 and 2. That means $1 debt, $2 equity. So the ratio was 1/2 to 1, 1/2 debt to $1 of equity. The power companies had ratios of 2 to 1, which I thought then was high. Well, heck, these banks were allowed to go up to 9 to 1, 90% debt, and then unbeknownst to me certainly, and I'd say most of America, they went up to 30 to 1 and even as high as 100 to 1, which means to say they had debt ratios, not of 33%, but of 97 to 99%.
Frank's showing off, man.
Well, this was, and what happens is they make a fortune when things are going well. They have a little bit of investment, so they're multiplying it by 30, but all things have to do is turn around and calamity results. And the fourth and final factor was the failure of regulation to allow such loans to be sold with such minimal amount of equity and with such fraudulent ratings. Blows my mind that the government could have tolerated that. That's what, and then New York, because of Wall Street contributing 20% to our revenue, we are facing a crisis I don't think New York has seen since the Great Depression.
I just want to, one point. I don't really disagree with anything that Frank said. His first point, though, about laying the guilt trip, I think there's probably some truth to that, but the reality is there is racial redlining, there is all the insidious practices that every study that's ever been done shows is race-based and affects minorities more so. But even if a congressional leader is laying a guilt trip, as Frank said, I'll say more conventionally, putting pressure on, it's still up to everybody that Frank was talking about, the rating agencies, the banks, to act in a proper manner. And maybe this, I don't want to think you think I'm pandering to the audience or anything like this, but there's an overlay to all of this.
Oh,
and it's called morality.
Oh,
there was a complete collapse of morality here.
I think we're all in agreement here, and I think that this is a perfect example of moral hazard. Now, I think your point about redlining is an appropriate concern, but I think what we're saying is that it was used unknowingly as a way to eviscerate credit standards and the need for credit standards. And I think that's where it became an event that was unforeseeable.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's unknowingly. I think that you're really onto something. I think that that Wall Street and others who are in the business of making oodles and oodles of money beyond most of our imaginations said, you know what, we have a perfect scenario here. We're getting pressure from the congressional people. They want us to do something on this. We can make a bundle. And you know what, there really isn't risk because we all know the things are going to go, the houses are going to go up. And I think they took advantage of the fact that there was pressure to do something, and they would get support from Congress who wanted to see discrimination, not only discrimination laws enforced, but that opportunity expanded. So I think this was a lot of sharks who saw an opportunity.
But you know, in all honesty, when they simply make judgments of racial discrimination because the percentage of loans not granted are higher amongst low-income blacks
of
or
the
Hispanics.
Same income in the same circumstances?
No, it's not different.
No,
That's the whole point. It's not. It was just on a racial basis.
No, you're wrong, Frank. I'm sorry.
Well, we disagree on this.
Well,
this is what
we
they
can
did.
disagree, but numbers is numbers.
This is why they went to.
This is
why they went to 0% down to buy a $400,000 home with zero down. Crazy. But this is what they had to do to get their quotas to show that they had a certain percentage of loans made to African Americans, Hispanics, and so forth, and I think that was disgraceful.
I think we have an honest disagreement here, which is good. It's healthy to see this. But having said that, Frank touched on a point earlier, Larry, and I want to get your thoughts on it, and that is when George Marlin, who was a guest on our show previously, George was saying about how Wall Street basically contributed 2% to the state's overall budget when you go back to 1980. Today, 2008, it's as much as 20% of the state's budget. So what are your thoughts about what are the two specific issues or problems that are going to face New York residents and taxpayers as a result of this fiscal crisis? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if Albany and Washington continue in the relationship that currently exists, the proportion of money that large urbanized states get, for instance, the way that when one level of government is in trouble, it kind of pushes off its problems to the next level. And when that level's in trouble, they push it down.
Further.
If that continues, we're going to see increased property taxes in a place like Long Island, or we're going to see a serious diminution of services.
But just to pause for a second. So here's the concept. We've had property values double, triple, quadruple over the last 15 or 20 years. We now have property taxes that have doubled and tripled here in Nassau and Suffolk County, but throughout large parts of New York. Yet now we're facing in a period of time when property values are declining, but real estate taxes are staying
because of the way
constant.
assessments are made. I don't want to get too technical
Right,
about this.
but
I know you understand this, everybody here understands it. But the way that the tax man values your property is a delay of several years. So what we will see is in 2 or 3 years, our assessments going down to match what the houses are worth. But that's going to take some time. The reality is that there's only a couple of ways to do this. You can do it the dishonest way, which is to indulge in fiscal gimmicks, and anything from borrowing, what we call one-shots, which is to sell a park and carry that as revenue when you know you're not going to get it the next year, so you dug your hole a little deeper. Or you can do it the honest way. And the honest way either is increase your revenues somehow, or cut your spending, or find a balance. And then there's a third way, which is to somehow, and which gets really, I think, to the heart of your question. I didn't mean to ramble on like this, because your question, was about, in talking about what George said, which is, our
Reliance on Wall Street,
right,
at the same time we're
is
facing
to
fiscal
also
problems.
try to find a little bit of balance in your economy, and not to rely on any one revenue stream, tax revenue stream. We need to be able to do that. How you do that may be above my pay grade.
Very Obama-esque.
You've got to encourage manufacturing, even though it's not very popular in a lot of communities. They're afraid of manufacturing. They think it's going to bring pollution and the like, and bring traffic. Manufacturing jobs tend to be the ones that create the middle class. We've constructed our economy locally and more statewide and service sector. And as long as people have money jingling in their pockets, you can make a living from the service sector, whether it's banking services or retail services. When that spigot dries up, to switch metaphors, then things get real thirsty, and that's where we're at now.
Frank, I'd like your thoughts on that too. And I mean, again, to go back to some of the key points, I think it's there was obviously in the November of 2008, it's now been estimated the nation lost over 500,000 jobs. It's been estimated by the Federal Reserve 70,000 jobs alone are going to be lost in the financial sector here in New York. What are your thoughts in terms of what this means to government in the state of New York?
And the two key issues, I think, with your question, the two major problems, in my judgment, that are facing New York more than most states. We have high income taxes, sales taxes, and so forth, but the number one problem, I'd say, is property taxes. And certainly in Long Island, the downstate suburbs. Upstate, the property values are so low that relative to the property values, their property taxes, while lower than Long Island, are even a higher percentage of the property's values. So property taxes almost stand out for New York State as being out of control. 60% of that, of course, is school taxes. So property taxes is number one. And the second biggest problem, in my judgment, is the quality of education in our cities, the major cities across New York State. New York City, and then Buffalo, Albany, Rochester, and so forth. I think educational quality is going to hurt New York. We come out in the middle, 20 to 30 states, time and again on the NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, and we're spending a fortune more than any other state, maybe one exception, and yet our educational quality is not good.
And this is what is going to make the next budget dance so tough, because you have these problems that Frank is talking about, and I could add 10 more. And you have the high taxes that are hurting a lot of people. But what do you do to take care of your problems in the competitiveness side? Bad schools, mass transit doesn't get people to work as fast as the business people need them. At the same time that you need to reduce your spending. How they connect the dots is going to be one of the great challenges and unfortunately, main event in Albany.
Well, let's stay on that theme, Frank. New York State, in aggregate, probably has the highest tax rates in the country when you compare business, income, property. What concretely can be done in New York State to address the growing tax?
And New York State is facing that right now. Governor Patterson and the legislature, and to be honest, I see an advantage of having one party control the governorship in both houses of the legislature, because now they can't blame the other. What has to be done, in my judgment, are 5 or 6 things that are major. And I think they're going to be, it's going to be interesting to see if the Democrats can deal with it. The Republicans, when there was a division of responsibility, both parties collapsed. They failed to address the problems. Pension reform for state employees. State, when I say state, I should say government. State, county, town, school district employees. Pensions are out of control. Most private companies have gone to defined contribution plans where each pays 50-50. In New York State, in schools, we pay 90%. Taxpayers pay 90%. Teachers pay 3% a year for 10 years. After that, they pay nothing. Most county and town employees pay nothing. The taxpayers are paying anywhere from 90 to 100%. This is in the multiple billions of dollars, and it cannot be changed. right now we're on what's called Tier 4. We've got to get to a Tier 5,
And Tier 6.
which will say we go to defined contribution, which means to say the taxpayers will pay half and you government employees are going to have to pay half. Now, we can't touch the existing employees, which for the next 10 years will be the bulk of the employees. What we can do to offset what we cannot change because of law is not give increases, no salary increases to current employees, well, not none, but instead of giving them a 3% increase, you give them maybe a 1.5% increase. You save 1.5%, do that for about 5 to 7 years, and you've in effect covered the pension costs that they legally cannot be made to pay. So that's pension costs are number one. Health is another one. Unbelievable. There was an article in Newsday very recently that said Nassau County, just one county, $236 million for health costs for 11,000 employees. Now, those health costs would pay for current employees 11,000 plus retirees. That works out to 21,000, say 20,000 per employee. That is mind-boggling, paid for 100% by the taxpayers. We've got to get again there to a shared system where the employees and the taxpayers pay 50-50. That is monumental, and that can be done by the state government, town governments, county governments, school districts.
Good luck.
They control that, and if they won't, we've got to do it. If we don't do it, we've got a calamity ahead here. And what that will also do is, when teachers and state employees have to pay half, they're suddenly going to think about the medical plan they're choosing. Instead of picking the luxurious plan they've got with practically no copay and so forth, they're going to be forced to make prudent decisions and pick one with a $20 or $30 copay and certain other things that normal people have to deal with. So health insurance is a big one. Police contracts. You know, Nassau Suffolk Police, it's not like this in the city. This does not apply to the city police. My father-in-law was a city policeman. It's different in the city police. They're making $65,000 a year. Long Island Police 3-4 years ago, front page of Newsday, $110,000 each with overtime, granted. Today that's got to be $125,000. Imagine a county policeman in Long Island or Westchester, $125,000 apiece with unbelievable, then they retire and they get $250,000 retirement packages for the vacation days and sick days they didn't take and so forth. How does this happen? Police have binding arbitration. One of the arbitrators, one of the best known is Martin Scheinman. He lives here in Port Washington where I live, in Sands Point. Met him, fine person, but the judgments he made were disgusting and disgraceful in my judgment. And the police are smarter than the county representatives at these negotiations. The police, the PBA knows to pick, hey, get Martin Scheinman as one of the arbitrators. They each pick an arbitrator and then they pick a third arbitrator. They outsmart us. The police outsmart us in negotiations.
The third arbitrator, though, is mutually agreed on by the
other two. But the point is, we've got to make sure the guy we pick will never agree to a Martin Scheinman. Another thing, school, we could deal with school costs. If we adopted some form of competition with our schools, we could deal with the poor quality issue facing our cities and in certain parts of the island as well, and reduce costs if we went to a plan that gave parents choice in education. As long as you funded them with amounts half or less than the cost of an average public school education. If you give them a scholarship to pick a school at, say, 40% of the cost of a public school education, taxpayers win, the parents win, the public schools are going to improve. We've seen that in Milwaukee and Cleveland. Even Washington is suddenly trying it a bit, although we'll see what Obama does.
But you've seen it not work in other places, too, so it's still out there.
I've actually, from the studies I've seen, at 90% of the time it's very successful. Where it's not, they stop them. They close down the schools.
We read different studies.
We read very different studies. Milwaukee, it's been done by the Harvard professors, Paul Peterson and others.
I don't trust Harvard.
I forget all the other, there are a lot of professors from
A
Harvard.
conservative like you trusts spouting Harvard. I can't believe this.
But
Michael, what's going on here?
Competition, well, competition
Great show.
works, as John Stossel did on Stupid in America, a very good documentary he did on ABC. Competition works every place. Why would it not work in education? Of course it would work in education. Now,
In the auto industry?
why have we not?
Why have we Wall Street? I don't think so.
Why have we not? Why have we not stopped? Why have we not dealt with this pension problem, this health insurance problem, choice for parents in schools? Why have we not dealt with it? The powerful teacher unions and other government unions. And sorry to say, both the Republicans and the Democrats have been terrified and intimidated by these public employee unions. They were terrified of them, and that's why I'm sort of happy the Republicans lost power, because Dean Skelos and the Republicans failed to stand up to the unions. The message I want to see the conservatives finally get out, if they get the guts up to do it, is tell the voters, you got to choose, folks. You can go with the Republicans or Democrats, each of whom caters to the unions, or you can side with the taxpayers. We've got to side with the taxpayers because New York State is going down to a fiscal calamity unless it deals with these issues of health insurance, pensions, cost of it. Medicaid is another area of corruption. We've got to start dealing with that. But I'll let Larry
Okay,
comment
Larry,
on some of these.
your turn. You have a lot to rebut
Well,
there.
well,
not to
no,
rebut,
no,
but the question is the same.
Yeah, yeah.
What does New York State have to do
Well,
to
let me-
reduce its high tax base?
I don't want to repeat, because again, like with the other questions, I don't disagree in many fundamental ways with what Frank was saying. He mentioned all the basic food groups. His analysis was mostly on, I think that some of his percentages weren't quite right. There are some nuances there that might matter to people, but not to belabor it.
My percentage is wrong?
Well, anytime a conservative rolls out Harvard, like I said before, I get nervous. You know, it's like next should be rolling out Brookings. Oh, by the way, I do work with Brookings, but my new day job is I'm executive director of the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. And if you can quote Hofstra University, I feel
Okay.
more comfortable. So anyways, just let me pick up where Frank ended up, which is the fear of the politicians when it comes to the unions. I look at it a little bit differently. If politicians did not want to fear the unions, they don't have to. Most of them run in districts where even if the unions try to run a primary against them, or much less a general election alternative, they're going to win. They may not win by 40 points or 30 points, but they're going to win. It's really a lack of will, it's a lack of courage, and it's laziness. Because if a politician decides to take on the union, and I'm talking about not somebody in a close race, we almost never have close races, but they will have to work. They will have to do the old-fashioned things like organizing citizens, go night after night to the groups that Frank wants to rally and to make the case. And maybe they'll only win by 7 or 8 points. Maybe, they'll have to sweat a little bit. And at this point, there are very few people who want to work that
Larry,
hard.
what other reason would they have for not dealing with the pension problem and the health insurance problem?
Well,
It's terror of the unions. There's no other
well, I
reason. They're not
think-
idiots, these
I don't think it's
legislators.
terror.
They're not idiots.
I think it's a terror of, maybe it's a terror, and I'm being sarcastic when I say terror, of 200 elderly people who aren't so sure how things work. They haven't really been in the union for 20 years, and they hear that people are going to cut their pensions, and they're terrified of it. And you can stand up there as a politician, and you can explain to them exactly what the truth is. And they will say, this is making me nervous. So the people that you're talking about, the taxpayers, are a very big and diverse group. And some of them, many of them, tens of thousands of them, want a pension system that takes care of people in the generous way we do. I have a different attitude about this. I don't mind paying the level of taxes that I'm paying, as long as it's proportionate to my income, to the value of my house. I'm willing to pay it because I want to see these services. What drives me nuts is that we do things so inefficiently. We do them so ineffectively. Frank mentions Medicaid. You could take 10% out of Medicaid and still do all the things that you do and begin to make it affordable. You can have a school system that starts to address the problems that Frank is doing if the school boards would show some spine, if we would reorganize into larger school districts where they could do things more efficiently. I can go on and on and on. I mean, this is the motherhood issues. I have a different, I consider myself kind of like a pragmatic progressive. I want to help these elderly people. I want to help the poor people. I want to protect people with a good police force. But I want my cops working more than 150 days a year. I'll pay them $100,000 to maybe keep temptation away and have guys who are college educated and can deal in nuance, but 150 days a year and then overtime pops in, a teacher working 9 months, 8 months a year when you take some of the winter vacations. I said, come on, how about a longer day? How about teaching summer school, quote unquote, for free? And how about, again, some of the getting real about benefits the way Frank was saying. We've got to go, as he says, to a different pension system, more shared services. If you just be more efficient and more effective and smart, you can be a generous state without eviscerating people and having them poor and begging on the streets.
I think those are all fair distinctions, and I would just say we've kind of gone through a couple of the issues, but we only have a couple of minutes left. What do you think are the most important social issues, and how are they going to play out in the coming years?
Social issues, in my judgment, facing New York: educational equality, that is a social issue. Abortion is a major issue in New York State. Child abuse, I think. The law in New York State, nobody even understands the law in New York State, that the only child abuse that these professionals who deal with children are required to report, nobody knows this, is abuse committed by the parent, which is only a quarter of all child abuse. 3/4 of all child abuse is committed by someone other than the parent. There is no legal obligation to even report that. And I think that the fact that both political parties are afraid to deal with it because of pressure from far-left groups like Planned Parenthood, the New York Civil Liberties Union, who want to have a 12-year-old, 13-year-old girl go for her abortion without having to consult with her parents. They put that priority.
That's accurate.
That was from the New York Times article, June 28th.
Now we got a conservative quoting from the New York Times.
I do it all
This
the time.
is driving me crazy.
That's why I did. That's why I say it. No, the New York Times reported on this. They were all set to correct the child abuse reporting legislation flaws, which started with the abuses in the Catholic Church and the investigations, and then they discovered, my goodness, the only abuse that has to be reported is child abuse committed by the parent. So the legislators all agreed, let's change it and require all child abuse to be reported by these mandated reporters. Suddenly, two groups objected. Per the New York Times, June of '02, it was Planned Parenthood and the New York Civil Liberties Union. Why? Because they thought it would interfere with the rights of 13-year-old girls to go for their abortion, because if they reported who they were having sex with, that person would be guilty of statutory rape, and it would be binding by law to report them, and they didn't want to have to do that. So they stopped the correction of this important child abuse reporting problem in New York State.
Larry, with 30 seconds.
Yeah, the most important issue, oh, you said social issue?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't disagree with Frank. I don't even disagree with him on abortion, except that at a time like this, and this is very easy for me to say if someone believes passionately in the issue, but at a time like this, the political capital it would take to deal with the issue that you will lose on politically in the short run, for sure, until you can change hearts and minds on this issue, or there are changes in medical technology that make abortions irrelevant and obsolete. You need to be focusing on education, for sure. You need to be focusing on homelessness and hunger.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a very spirited debate tonight, as always. Our guests were Frank Russo, the Conservative Party of New York State, President in Nassau County, and of course Larry Levy. And we want to correct the record. Larry is the National Director of Suburban Studies at Hofstra University here in Long Island. Our co-host, Conal Friel, thank you so much for joining us this week to discuss issues, fiscal problems in New York State. Thank you.